welcome. We're delighted to have you all here. This is going to be a new experience for us because we start a project like this. We started it 6 months ago and had a little different understanding of what the election may have produced. Now all of a sudden we have questions being raised about, America first and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to have to be a little bit flexible today when we have our conversation, and we'll count on all of you for asking questions to kind of bring out a little bit more of the richness of this conversation. My name is John Hamry. I'm the president here at CSIS, and before we have events like this with friends from outside, we always start with a little safety announcement. I'm responsible for your safety, and so if something happens, I'd ask you to follow my instructions. The emergency exits are right back here, obviously that door and that door over there. This one's closest to the stairs that'll take us down to the street. We will go directly behind us around to the National Geographic, where we have an arrangement. I'll bring in ice cream and we'll sing a song of praise for our survival, okay? We'll be just fine. If anything happens, just follow my instructions. We'll be fine. It's my role really just simply to welcome you and to say thank you to Funabashi-san and his colleagues who are here with us to help explore this. But I can't help myself to just say something about the narrative that's unfolding right now in Washington. This narrative that the next 4 years are going to be about America first. And I said to my colleagues, I don't remember a time in my 40 years when it wasn't about America first. I mean, it gives the implication that America has one of its deepest and most important alliances with Japan, and that that's a gift to somebody else, is nonsense. It is what we do for ourselves. It is what it means to be America first. I mean, our strategy was we knew we had to provide global security in the post-Cold War era, or certainly during the Cold War. We weren't going to do that by ourselves. We couldn't afford to do that by ourselves. We had to do that with allies. And think what a blessing it's been that we've had allies as strong as Japan to be our partner with this. So now to create the image or the implication to Americans who are feeling weird these days, are feeling sorry for themselves, don't know exactly why, but they're feeling sorry because somehow we've been cheated by other countries who've taken advantage of it. That's just wrong. It's completely wrong. We entered into these alliances because they were crucial for our well-being. So we got to start talking about this openly. I mean, rather than have it hidden behind some narrative, this idea that somehow we're doing this for our own best interest is wrong. And we're going to explore some of that today. We're also going to explore today, I think, a neglected area of intellectual inquiry. And that is the way that the global patterns of commerce and trade are fundamentally creating new geopolitics. I mean, this is completely new for us. And the idea that somehow we can revert back to an autarkic environment where we're going to be safe because we'll only trade with Maryland, Only Maryland and Virginia are going to trade with each other. I mean, that's just completely crazy. Our well-being is tied very much to our role on a global stage economically, as is Japan's. And so we're going to talk about those things today and understand a little bit deeper what this is meaning, because we're seeing a phenomena that is, I think, underappreciated in America, the way in which global commerce is reshaping the nature of the Eurasian continent. So these are very big issues, and I'm glad we have these colleagues that have been spending time for us. We're going to take advantage of their research over the last 6 months. So thank you all for coming. Funabashi-san, let me turn to you. You're going to open this conference for real, and I want to say thank you for being our partner here, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for your kind introduction. For me, it carries a special significance to be always at the CSIS. We have been very much privileged to cooperate with CSIS on many programs. Particularly today, we will be focused on geoeconomics and its significance in the world, particularly in Asia Pacific. At our institute, we initiated a new program on geoeconomics a year ago because we thought Japan, perhaps as well as the United States, is very much behind the game, which China and Russia and some other countries have been pushing for. Perhaps that we are seeing a very much states utilizing that economic leverage to achieve that geopolitical goals. And we have been totally unprepared for this new challenge and risks. I think that perhaps AIIB and One Belt, One Road, I think were perhaps a crude awakening to all of us, how unprepared intellectually and policy-wise we were. So we decided to stand up a program as we came to realize there are more and more instances and cases where that states resort to that geo-economic measures. And the product we are going to publish in May, and we have been very much fortunate to have very strategic thinkers, authors, and I have actually brought 4 of them, that authors, to CSS seminar today. But we have all benefited from strong support and collaboration from CSIS over the years. With regard to this program, we are very much fortunate to have Dr. Michael Green. We invited him to our exercise in Tokyo last summer, and we had a very extensive exchanging views and notes. And that the essence of that, those profound discussions, actually are incorporated in that book. English version we were going to publish by the end of the year. We are going to hold 5th anniversary commemorative event next month in Tokyo. And we are very much privileged to have Dr. Hamre serve as a keynote speaker for this event. The theme would be about the think tank, 21st century think tank visions. What kind of role that think tank really should play in the coming years, and particularly against the Asia and Pacific international environment. What can that think tanks be value added. So there's no think tank leader better qualified than John Hamre anywhere in the world. So we are very much privileged to have him as a keynote speaker. We also have been very much fortunate to collaborate with Mr. Matthew Goodman. He is, as you know, the senior advisor on Asian economics, and William E. Simon, chair of in political economy at CSIS. Matt has kicked off a new program titled One to Punch. The U.S.-Japan forging a stronger economic alliance between the U.S. and Japan. He kindly invited Mr. Hiroyuki Nakashima, RJIF's first Washington liaison. He's an Oxford-educated economist, and we have been very much fortunate to now have him as a Washington liaison. This program actually really meshes with our Geo-Economic program. So thank you very much for Matt for inviting Mr. Nakashima. Mr. Nakashima, would you stand up? Yeah. He's our, Mr. Nakashima is our Washington liaison. We actually published a report on the quiet deterrence report 3 years ago. This is about the power equation, new dynamics of power equation in East Asia, as we are confronted with China's more aggressive, assertive and aggressive posture, particularly in maritime security, as well as North Korea's rapid development of nuclear capability. And the conclusion was quiet deterrence. That aims to avoid provocation and escalation, while cultivating the capability to strengthen that capability to deter, defend, and deny that a possible aggression. This is a strategic concept to strengthen the balance of power without security dilemma, without suppressing China's rise. But most recently, as I said before, we have been confronted with a challenge and risks and challenge of geo-economic thrust, particularly from China, but also to some extent Russia and other countries. So that's the backdrop of our exercise. Today, we are very much fortunate to have 4 presenters. All of them are authors of the book, forthcoming book. The first, Professor Toshihiro Nakayama. He is a professor at Keio University, specializing in the U.S. domestic politics and U.S.-Japan alliance. He will share his study and insights of this radically changing the U.S. domestic politics and its implication for Japan and the U.S.-Japan relationship. He would warn Japan not to be caught in what he calls Trump trap. He would elaborate further. We also have Professor Terada Takashi of Doshisha University. He is an economist, and particularly specializing in international economy and trade. He will focus on the failure of TPP and its impact on Japan's trade policy, as well as Japan's Asian policy. Yesterday, President Trump finally put a nail in TPP's coffin. So this looks to be extremely little hope of maintaining this, having this TPP strategy. It's almost dead now. But he argues that Japan, with other Asian TPP signatory countries, to maintain this framework, and if possible, forming TPP minus the United States. But at the same time, realistically speaking, we should come up with a plan B. So what should this plan B be all about? That's what he would elaborate. We have also Mr. Yoichi Kato. He is, as you know, one of the most celebrated Japanese journalists specializing in national security policy. We are very much fortunate to have him as a senior research fellow at our institute right now. He's also adjunct fellow at CSIS. That's another feature of a very close cooperation with CSIS. He will be focused on how Japan can really cope with this Trump shocks. If the United States would be determined to pursue America First policy, how can it really mesh into Japan's traditional alliance strategy, Japan's U.S. relationship? What possibly could be the alternative to that if it does not mesh, if it does not fit well? Finally, we have Professor Ken Jimbo of Keio University. He is a theoretician, theorist of international relations and world politics. He would deal with the future and viability of liberal international order, which the US and Japan have cooperated to uphold over the past 70 years. But now it looks increasingly that that foundation of liberal international order being now challenged, no other than by the United States. So that implication would be profound. What kind of implication would be, and how Japan and the United States should deal with that. So we have very good, strong lineups of presenters today. So I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation. Thank you.
So thank you, Yoichi. Thank you, John Hamry. I'm Mike Green, the Senior Vice President for Asia here at CSIS, and it's my privilege to moderate this panel. I met with these scholars in Tokyo over the summer, and others involved in this Geo-Economics project led by Dr. Funabashi as a reviewer of their papers, as a skeptic, as a decision, not a decision maker, but as a sort of a conversation driver, as a stick in the mud, and sort of challenge these excellent scholars. I understand that the new manuscripts they've written in each of their areas for each of the chapters of this forthcoming volume have been revised, and I think after today's discussion and my colleagues' visit here to Washington may be revised again. So we want to hear from each of the authors about their argument. We won't summarize the whole chapters, but the basic argument, how they've adjusted that since the U.S. election, and then challenge them a bit up here on the stage, and also invite your questions to help make this a strong product. It will be published in May and then translated in English. RJIF has an excellent track record on doing something that think tanks don't do that much anymore, which is large volumes on major problems. The first big success early in RJIF's life as a think tank was a report on the causes and lessons from the 3/11 tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear disaster, which of many, many reviews and reports done had probably the most impact on public and political opinion and ultimately policy. And then, as Dr. Funabashi said, the national security strategy that RJIF did, drawing on these four gentlemen and other scholars, and producing what is really a very clear, coherent, comprehensive national security strategy. I've worked on several of our national security strategies and quadrennial defense reviews. We would be lucky to have as much coherence in our strategic documents these days. The other interesting thing about it, I recommended to you, is that, of course, Prime Minister Abe put out his national security strategy, the first by a Japanese prime minister, and I'll leave it to you to decide which was better. They were both good. The RJIF version was more honest and makes for excellent reading, and really demonstrates the wealth of strategic thinking in Japan and the success of Yoichi I and Yoichi II, Funabashi and Kato, in harnessing the really best and brightest rising minds in Japan's foreign policy, economic, and international relations fields. The premise for this project on geoeconomics was in part that certain things are immutable in international relations, such as geography, and that other things, such as economics, often take some time to assess in terms of their impact on international security and international relations. So our panel today is presenting papers that assess, as they did before the election, these kind of immutable and larger trends, but trying to do it in the context of a new administration that's only been in office a few days. And one question inevitably will be, does the rhetoric we hear out of the new administration, and particularly the inaugural speech, which was, I think it's fair to say, shocking to most people around the world, does that represent a linear path, linear trajectory of what Americans' role in the world will be? Maybe. I tend to think not. It's hard for me to imagine the cabinet that's being confirmed this week implementing much of that, to be honest. And you can clearly hear in the testimony of key national security cabinet members on the Hill, you can clearly hear open disagreement with elements that were in that speech. So we're in an uncertain world, and I think we can help our colleagues make sense of it in our Q&A, and they can help us make sense of, what is really part of the larger dynamic in international relations and U.S.-Japan relations, and what might now be at risk or changing or not. So with that as a brief introduction, and we'll come back and have some Q&A. Let me open up with Nakayama Sensei, who is like John Hamre from South Dakota, and has done other important things that Funabashi-san told you about.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Since I was in charge of U.S.-Japan relations, which we thought it was a constant in Iraq, I totally had to rewrite my manuscript. And, I think we're facing a radical geopolitical uncertainty, and this geopolitical uncertainty is coming from the United States. Like I said, we thought this American internationalism, we have taken that for granted, but now we see a chance that this may be fundamentally changing. American carnage speech was a bad sign in particular. We hope that he didn't really believe what he is saying, but I guess now we know that he actually believes what he is saying. And this inaugural speech was a manifesto of American first and the economic nationalism. And it wasn't your typical inaugural speech, but it was sort of like a launching of a political movement. We all hope that this American internationalism would never change, but now I guess we have to realize that the hope is not a policy. So we must deal with the Trump administration as it is. But also at the same time, we have to realize that this predictability, which is one of the important elements of the alliance, it has become a very scarce resource. For the past decade, I think the United States of America has been a rock and a constant, and a bedrock of many of the institutions in our region. And Japan also took American internationalism for granted, and many of our policy was premised upon the fact that U.S. would remain a resident power in Asia Pacific. We always knew that you had this cycle of intervention and retrenchment, and but sooner or later American internationalism would prevail. That was the perception we had. But Mr. Trump and the phenomena may be representing something totally new. So I would like to sort of address how we're accepting or understanding the result of this election. I think there's three patterns to our reaction. There's one, Trump pessimists or Trump skeptic types. And the second is, the Trump optimist. There's quite a few Trump optimists in Japan, and many of them are the business types, and there's anti-establishment types in Japan as well. And the third category is the nothing really happened types. And I would say that the alliance handlers, many of the alliance handlers, is type 1 at heart, but acting like the type 3. There's no choice, I guess. And during the past presidential elections, we've been complaining that Japan is never on the agenda. But this time around, there were many colorful statements about Japan. In the past, U.S.-Japan experienced some difficulties, for sure. In the early 90s, Dr. Funabashi actually wrote a book, Alliance Adrift. And that was a result of the common enemy disappearing because the Cold War ended. So there were arguments in Japan and arguments here, I guess, in the United States as well, that what is this alliance for? There was this question period. Of course, we're too confident on the Japanese side, and you had your own sort of revisionist, which was very critical of Japan. But I guess in the latter half of the 1990s, we came out with this rhetoric that sort of would justify the alliance, which is that this alliance is not just to deal with threats, but it is about two nations sharing values, upholding a regional order, which is good for U.S. and Japan, but not only that, it will be good for the region as well. So that was how sort of the alliance was redefined, and it was deepened since then. So U.S.-Japan alliance became a sort of an alliance which would uphold a liberal international order. And precisely because of this formulation, it's in spirit, it sort of became an alliance of co-equals. We stopped talking about whether we rely on the U.S. or not, because in spirit, we were together upholding the alliance. And this was the very successful narrative we developed. But I think that's being shattered, I think. Yes, after the election, this talk about Japan is more or less not disappeared, but toned down, I would say. And we hope that the importance of Japan to the United States have penetrated the team. But just the simple fact that the president has stopped talking negatively about Japan, and the fact that he seems to be tough on China, doesn't sort of signify that everything is okay. Because U.S.-Japan alliance is not a standalone institution. I think whether it truly functions depends on how America embraces Asia as a whole and define America's role in the region. So, you have interest in the alliance, you see the importance of Japan, but if you're not interested in the region, and if you're not interested in the order of the region, maybe the U.S.-Japan alliance itself won't function as we plan. So the fact, also the statement that Japan is important doesn't convince us fully. America has to convince us that you are a resident power, an integral part of Asia, and I think this was, that was the essence of the rebalance policy of the Obama administration. For us, no matter who the president is, U.S.-Japan relations remains to be the most important relations. Not only one, but the most important. But in Japan, there's this sentiment that we are choosing the United States because there's no other options. Sort of a reluctant embrace of the United States. And that is particularly strong among the ordinary public. Among the policymakers and among the alliance handlers, we realize that America is the best choice. So we affirmatively, positively choose the U.S. But among the Japanese public, there is this sentiment that because there's no other choice, we're with the U.S. Therefore, that narrative that I just talked about, that in spirit with the co-equals, becomes important. But under the Trump administration and the noise on U.S.-Japan relations increases, I think the uneasiness about Japan relying on America would increase for sure. So in order to avoid this, I think it is important for us to rethink why we're choosing Japan. And in a sense, we have to reselect U.S.-Japan relationship precisely because it is the Trump era. And in Japan, there's a Trump hype right now. Mr. Trump is all over media, not only on serious news, but in entertainment, televisions, and tabloids and a lot. And we are sort of overreacting to Mr. Trump and what Mr. Trump represents. But this hyped up image of Mr. Trump's makes us very difficult to understand what really is going on in the United States. So to lose these overreaction and sort of meddle with this uneasiness about our reliance on the U.S. is the Trump trap, I think. And that's the Trump trap we have to avoid, because U.S.-Japan is still the most important relations for us. So we have to, the attitudes we have to maintain is don't overreact, stay calm, but be aware. That would be the advice I would give to the Japanese, not just the policy people, but the Japanese public and especially the media as well. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Terada-san is in the unenviable position of having just finished an excellent strategy paper on TPP the day Donald Trump announced we're leaving TPP, but he still has a solution, I think. So Terada-san, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. I don't know whether I have some solutions or not, but I just try to describe some sort of the possible scenarios, particularly after Mr. Trump signed the executive order yesterday to withdraw United States from TPP. My role in this book was to write a chapter on particular regionalism or regional integration, particularly from the perspective of the mutual exclusiveness pursued by China and the United States. So what sort of policy implications, for example, AIIB excluding the United States or TPP excluding China have, particularly for Japan and also US-Japan relationships. But today, particularly after coming to DC, I came here Sunday from Singapore, which I'm currently living, 20 hours flight, more than that. So I'm still struggling with something. But I just try to extend some of the argument which I originally wrote for the book and reconfigured some of the scenarios, so which I just completed in PowerPoint submitted 2 hours ago. Okay, only two pages. So first page just described how the TPP would be helpful for achieving what Mr. Trump wants to also achieve. So I think some of the points already you must have heard. And for example, that would be helpful for America's exporters, particularly agricultures. Japan made a huge concessions on agricultures. And of course, that's not only for the United States, but also America's rival agriculture exporter, Australia. Even Japan already had signed FTA with Australia, in which tariffs on the beef has been already reduced, making the American beef in a very disadvantaged position in terms of the prices. Of course, I'm not talking about quality, but something like that. Even someone talked about, China may take the leadership role, regional integration, or something like that. But I personally taking a little bit cautious views on China taking a leadership role instead of United States, especially writing economic new rule or something like that. Particularly this year, China should be busy for more domestic politics, and also, the sort of suffering from the social security problems, which recently, the Xi Jinping government has been tackling with. So I think Trump government's, decision to withdraw TPP, or just make TPP dead, would be pride, of course, fortunate, particularly because China can buy a time for promoting some of the more domestic economic reforms, like SOEs, for example. Someone said, China should join TPP, something like that. But in order to do that, China needed to make some huge domestic political reforms, economic reforms, like SOEs. But SOEs currently account for more than 40% of China's total GDPs. So it's very, very difficult. If you look at the steels, China cannot, solve the so-called overcapacity problems of steels, but partly because, they cannot destroy the steel companies. They're all SOEs. And the Chinese Communist Party has a very strong voice within each SOE companies and steel. If China did it, I'm sure the domestic turmoil would take place. That would be so much disastrous for the Chinese government. So again, I'm still thinking, even TPP were alive, China found it very difficult to join. So that's why, the logic is that, again, without TPP, China certainly, relieved and taking more time for the domestic economic reforms, rather than taking some radical, initiative in promoting regional economic integration, something like that. But anyway, key message here today is the next page, so-called possible scenario Japan can pursue or may pursue. Well, plan A, plan B, I have also plan B plus. Plan A is, yes, TPP takes effect, despite Donald Trump, the harsh criticism of TPP. But in order for the other 11 TPP member countries to still make TPP alive, take some revisions. Again, I know that it's probably already impossible. However, some of the probable possibilities still exist, it seems to me. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had a telephone call with the Australian counterparts, Turnbull, yesterday. They had already met, 2 weeks ago when the Prime Minister Abe visited Sydney. He also, visited Philippines, Indonesia, and also Vietnam. But Australians, the summit meeting was purely focused on TPP. So I think now the Australia-Japan have been working quite closely to work on what TPP should be done. And Prime Minister Turnbull's offer, as far as I read, was to promote TPP with the United States. But Prime Minister Abe still has some strong loyalty and faith in Mr. Trump. Without the United States, TPP would be useless. So in this case, there's still some different views existed. But Japanese government seems to me gradually, already understand the destiny of the TPP, particularly after the Trump's decisions and over the last day or 2 days, something like that. So plan B, TPP minus USA. This is something which already some Latin American leader, Chile, Peru already mentioned. But could it be possible or not? I think it's possible. by changing the small parts of the clauses. So 11 member countries agreed, and then we should set up. But on the other hand, following Mr. Abe's the statement yesterday, still U.S. was significant for TPP and also for Japanese economy. But I think considering the U.S.-Japan bilateral FTA, this is something which Mr. Trump wants to achieve, what should be also accepted. So again, Plan B means TPP minus USA and U.S.-Japan bilateral FTA. I'm not talking or, A or B, A and B. Otherwise, significance of U.S. could not be sustained. So probably Japan and other TPP member countries should keep some of the options for United States to come back. The TPP negotiation, even bilaterals, FTA negotiation takes some time. Few years, probably 3 or 4 years. 4 years, what will happen in this country? Another election. Your government just started, but we should consider who will be coming next. I think government should consider about it. So Plan B, TPP minus USA, and bilateral FTA between Japan and the United States. I know some Japanese media expressed concern, well, U.S. the pressure could be much more stronger. This is something which I think Trump wants to do, particularly focusing on agriculture. But personally, U.S. external pressure on agriculture liberalization would be welcome, because this is sort of necessary for promoting more Japanese agriculture liberalization, it seems to me. Otherwise, the LDP has been always facing the so-called election, the destiny every 2 or 3 years. So to overcome that, I think that some strong pressure from the United States would be, I think, useful. But on the other hand, Japan should also work harder to make U.S. more concessions on automobiles. TPP's automobile concession in the United States is almost nothing, according to automobile industry in Japan. 25 years time is necessary for eliminating 2.5% tariffs on commercial, 30 years for 25% on the pickup trucks. Who would be surviving in 30 years, among the negotiation teams? So I think Japan should work harder in this case again to get more concessions as a sort of creating rationale for Japan to pursue the bilateral FTA with the United States. Finally, Plan B plus. We have another framework of regional integration in addition to TPP, RCP or RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. ASEAN plus 6, the framework. Point is, United States is excluded. And Mr. Turnbull also said China might be feeling easier to come to TPP without the United States. So in this case, some RCP members are invited to TPPs, but I have a bit different, opposite views. TPP member countries who are not part of the RCP should be invited to TPP. Feature Canada, Mexico, Peru, and Chile. I think that's much easier. And that would be welcome for Japanese consideration to make RCP a high standard regional integration framework. Again, Mr. Abe already mentioned in his platform speech a couple of days ago, RCP was also something which Japan wants to pursue. So I think with RCP, TPP linkages, which I initially didn't agree because of the exclusiveness of the regionalism, as I mentioned in the beginning. I think strategically this element is very significant for the United States, I thought. But now TPP probably would not exist. So again, TPP RCP linkages could be probably considered to create a sort of the step towards realizing the EFTA, free trade area in Asia Pacific. I know this is not the real formation of EFTA, because EFTA is APEC-wide FTA, which includes Russia, Papua New Guinea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, something like that. But RCP includes ASEAN 10 member states. So it's a bit different, but nevertheless, this could be probably useful to form a 20-country FTA. again, sorry to say this for United States, this is sort of the way for put pressure on Mr. Trump governments to reconsider the regional integration, also significance in Asia, because U.S. businesses would be certainly discriminated and facing a quite strong discriminations. I'm sure the U.S. business lobbies should be working much harder to persuade Mr. Trump. Otherwise, their businesses would be very, very difficult. So again, it would take time, but probably something which Asia or Japan should consider about it as a way for making U.S. more friendly and cooperative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yoichi, Japan's strategic options now.
Right. Sure.
I don't know how to do this.
はいはい。
これどうしたらいいんですかね。
これね、消して戻ります。戻りました。はい。
Okay. My argument is pretty simple. I call Japanese alliance strategy toward the United States America hugging. And when it's faced with America first strategy, as the Trump administration puts out, the compatibility between those two deteriorates. And it's hard for Japan to maintain this America hugging diplomacy. What is it? Oh, I pushed the wrong one, sorry. Okay, and this mismatch between Japan's diplomacy and U.S. diplomacy will weaken the alliance and weaken complicate Japanese political situation, domestic political situation, and probably weaken Abe administration, and eventually destabilize the region. That's my argument, and I'm going to explain a little bit more detail. So what's the characteristics of Trump foreign policy? As we have seen in the inaugural address, I think it was clearly explained that he prioritized individual interests over common values. And he prioritized unilateralism over multilateralism. In short, those are I think, two main characteristics of the foreign policy of Trump administration. I made a kind of a matrix to see how the values and interests and common and individual interact each other, and how you can analyze the Trump foreign policy. Basically, Trump foreign policy is based on, as I said, driven by mainly individual interests, right bottom. So it's very close to China's foreign policy, which is driven by core interest. So America first is basically a core interest. So China's foreign policy and Trump foreign policy is very similar in that sense. And pre-Trump U.S. were basically upper left, driven by common values like democracy and human rights. And of course, there is an exception, which was the Bush administration, which was down left, which was an individual value, led by neocon and conducted foreign policy by unilateralism. But basically, U.S. foreign policy were driven by common values. And of course, it doesn't really deny the existence of interest, but basically. And so this is a really drastic change from the traditional U.S. foreign policy, and that really makes it difficult for Japan to hug the United States, because the main structure of the foreign policy will be totally different. So what is going to happen? And I think it is not possible for any other countries like Japan to push Trump from this individual interest-driven foreign policy to common values, because Trump doesn't care, it seems to me, about democracy promotion or human rights. He never said anything through the campaign and also the inaugural address. And so I think the key battlefield of the foreign policy in the region will be common interest upper right. And that's where China can come in. And so there's where Japan, United States, China, and other Southeast Asian countries also can really compete each other. And that's the source of the problem that we are going to have. Japan is not going to have any leverage by being what we call a like-minded country with the United States, because the United States is not like-minded anymore. So that's the problem. And I just skipped this. And so Japan has two kinds of concerns about Trump administration. Number one is about domestic economy. Before Trump really came into power, there was a view in Japan that Trump could be a good news, because the view was Trump will increase the public works, increase the investment in public works in the United States, which will lead to increase of domestic demands in the United States, and makes it lead to a strong U.S. dollar. And that will make Japanese economic handling easier. Because the reason why Abe has been successful in handling the economy are two reasons. One is cheap yen, Japanese yen, and high stock prices. That leads to economic stability. And the other one was the argument of structural reform by using TPP. And TPP was a kind of an excuse, or maybe it's a facade, but a reason that Abe can talk about the third arrow, because TPP could be the driver for domestic economic reform. But now, as we see, TPP is gone, and there's a concern in Japanese business circle that this cycle of investment of public works, increasing domestic demand, and strong U.S. dollar may not really happen, because there's a strong rivalry between executive branch and Congress, as you know. And Trump has to have the Congress on his side in order to really execute this economic cycle. And McCain and on the other side, trying to criticize Trump, it may not happen. So there's a serious concern that Trump actually could be a really bad news for Japan. So that's one element. And the other concern is foreign policy. As I said, there's an absence of values and no democracy promoting human rights. And as we have heard in an inaugural speech, Trump said that we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone. It was very clear. And there's a concern that he doesn't really understand the value of Japan as an ally. And because of those elements, absence of values, lack of understanding of Japan's value, perhaps he could cut the deal with China, ignoring Japan, like the Nixon did when Nixon normalized the relationship with China, and trading Japan's national security interest away in return for economic gain. That's the concern. I'm not predicting that's going to happen, but there's a serious concern. But if you look at the public opinion poll, the Japanese public still have high hope on the United States or dependence. This is a public opinion poll that the Yomiuri Shimbun conducted right after the election, and the first question was that a good news for Japan that Trump won, and 60% people are not good. And actually, it's growing. And the recent public opinion poll by Asahi Shimbun indicated that this trend, that to see the victory of Trump is more negative than favorable to Japan. But if you ask, this heavy dependence on United States through alliance, whether this should be maintained or reviewed. As you see, 60% of the people say that it should be maintained. And if you ask another question, should the United States stay as a global leader, even under President Trump, 70% of the Japanese people thought, United States should stay as a global leader. And that's really contradict, but that's the view that the Japanese public has. So with this kind of domestic situation, what kind of impact would it have on Japan's policy, foreign policy? First of all, as a reaction to what is happening, it has to be a multidimensional hedging. That's, I think, what has to happen. As I have listed a number of the risks that emerges, I don't go each one of them, but you can categorize U.S.-related risks, starting with the emergence of the Trump administration, China-related risks, I think I don't have to go into detail, and Korea-related risks. There are a number of the risks, and they are increasing and getting stronger. And so Japan has to take the multi-dimensional hedging policy. That's a must. And then, what's the strategic choice that Japan has if Japan cannot depend on the United States anymore? So default position is America hugging, as I said. Then what are the other theoretical choices? This is the area where Professor Jimbo is really expert. But the first is internal balancing. Those three categories I took from Professor Jimbo's website, by the way. First is internal balancing, and build up its own military capabilities to be independent of the United States. And second is external balancing. Look for alternative alliances or coalitions. And third is bandwagoning, flat-out accommodation to China. Okay, let's see one by one. Internal balancing, build up its own military capabilities to be independent of the United States. Sounds good, right? If we can depend on the United States, perhaps we should, build up capabilities on our own so that we don't have to depend on Trump administration anymore. But question is, and there's the drivers, anti-American nationalism and anti-Trump sentiment. But those are the kind of the element that Japan really have to be careful in dealing with, as Professor Nakayama explained in his concept of Trump trap. And eventually, this internal balancing, the build up its own military capability, is self-defeating. Because if Japan really build up its own capabilities, without talking about going nuclear, to cut the chase, Japan's security doesn't increase. Region is going to be destabilized, and the surrounding security environment will deteriorate, and Japan will be in a worse shape than it is. And second, external balancing. Okay, alternative alliances and coalitions, theoretically may be viable, but with whom is Japan going to align with? Middle power coalitions like Australia, like one of the scholars in Australia advocates. But Australia, Korea, or Indonesia. But is it going to be strong enough to really replace Japan-U.S. alliance? No, right? And we don't have any other possible partners. So this second choice is not really viable either. And third, bandwagoning to China. There are very few people in Japan who wants to accommodate to China. The public opinion poll would not allow that. So looking at all those options, actually there's no options. Japan has to stay with this default position. Japan has to keep on hugging the United States. Whether you're frustrated or not, that's the reality. And so what is going to happen is, with this kind of reality of strategic choice, But there, with Trump administration pushing this America First agenda, that will really increase the pressure in Japan on Abe administration to do something different. But actually, as I said, there's nothing that Abe can do as a strategic choice that will really weaken the Abe administration, and that will really deepen the dilemma that the Japan as a whole is going to feel. And as I said, not just this weakens the political basis of Japanese Abe administration. By the way, I'm not really on the position to support Abe, but I'm just talking about the political reality. And also, eventually, this will really weaken the alliance. Even though Trump said that he will reinforce the old alliances in his inaugural address, but if he pursues this America First agenda, it will really damage the alliance with the United States.
Pug. That was excellent. Thank you. We're going to come back to those themes, I'm sure.
Well, thank you very much. I know that we need to secure the time for interaction, so I try to make my presentation as brief as possible. What I'm going to talk is to provide the broader outlook of why the concept of the geo-economics matter, and why this concept should be factored in as one of the pillar concept to manage the US-Japan alliance. And I'll offer my observation of the external circumstances. And let me start by introducing the most recent publication by the Eurasia Group, usual suspects, of the top 10 risks, which they publish at the beginning of this year. The overall theme of this year's theme that they actually put forward was the recession of geopolitics, geopolitical recession. And we'll say, wait a minute, in recent years, we'll talk about the revenge of geopolitics in every part of the region. China's rise, North Korea, Russian reassertiveness in every part. And then we talk about how the concept of the geopolitics have been so important. By looking at the report by the USA Group, they are talking about geopolitical recession by the United States. So America First policy is all about the retrenchment of those exceptionalism policy of the United States, which maintain the stable world order for past many decades. But in my understanding, it is not all about United States. It is about the geopolitical reality because of the intensity has risen so much in both regions, both in Asia and Europe. We have lost the interactiveness in both regions. By looking at the 10 years ago, in 2006 and 2007, we actually offer a lot of like a globalized agenda on the alliance management. Looking at the US-Japan alliance, in 2005, we actually conceptualized the common strategic objectives, which stretches from the region to the globe. And self-defense force have dispatched our forces to Indian Ocean, Iraq, and participate the anti-piracy operation in Bay of Aden. Those are the global outreach of our self-defense force in past, in past 10 years. NATO was also talking about the globalization of its scheme and operations. They serve as a headquarter at the ISAF operation in Afghanistan, security sector reform in Afghanistan, participate in the various operations in the Mediterranean Sea. They are even talking about adding the membership beyond Europe. so that we were interacting with the alliance function together much more than what we are having as of today. As of today, what we are doing is rise of China, North Korea, Russia, massive inflows of the refugee into Europe, and also the potential terrorism. So each regions are very busy with each other. And so that those kind of geopolitical recession also applies to the geographical space concept that allies are now looking very much inside rather than interacting with each other. That's a very interesting phenomena. But it doesn't mean that the globalization phenomena has shrinked, because economic scale has been another great measurement to look at the current external circumstances. If I go to Brussels, many of the European experts tell me why Japan is so inclined to Russia on upgrading its Japan-Russia relationship. And if those people come to Tokyo, we also express our blunt view why Europeans are so engaging economically in China without making the conditionality. So which means that if the geopolitical space has been shrunk, the geo-economic space is always very much interactive. What is missing is cross-referencing of each other's conditions. So what we need probably is asking Europeans to engage China with higher conditions, to look at our situation in South China Sea, in East China Sea, and also in Korean Peninsula. And what we need to address from our Japanese government perspective is to provide a broader kind of outlook over how we should engage Russia in dealing with not only in Northeast Asia, but also in European front as well. So that's why we really need why those geopolitical concepts has to be in line with our economic engagement policy, especially in emerging economies like China and also Russia as economic power. So we also have found that there has been a series of so-called opportunistic rise of geo-economy, mainly in the Eurasian continents. And the concept of the geo-economy, as Dr. Funabashi has laid out at the outset, it can be defined in various terms. It probably utility of having a definition of like a use of economic instrument to promote and defend national interests for geopolitical goals may help to understand the phenomena, what's been happening, especially in the Eurasian continents. For example, One Belt, One Road initiatives that contains two components, like a Silk Road economic belts and Maritime Silk Roads, which was also funded by the China Silk Road funds and also the AIIB. And Russia has its own version of expanding its Eurasian economic community encompassing Central Asian countries and also beyond. And what's striking is that those concepts are beginning to be merged together for both two countries, since two countries are seeking for the connection between Silk Road's economic belts and also the Eurasian economic community. So these might be the emerging reality of how those aligned concepts can emerge as a huge impact on the international relations, especially in the Eurasian continents. So let me just to offer what would be the impact for Japan and also the U.S.-Japan alliance facing with these new reality. And probably we are facing with unprecedented systemic challenge to so-called the liberal international order, briefly by shifting of the balance of power, and second is the rising of the state capitalism as the standardization of those emerging economies to forge its powers to the economy, and also we have witnessed the poor performance of the democracy in especially the advanced nations. Under those circumstances, I think what we need to do in 2017 is we really need to anchor the efforts to vanguard the free trade, rule of law, and also the democracy. And Kato-san mentioned that there's no other choice, but I think what we try to do is to at least really try to anchor those long-standing concepts to forge liberal international order from our end. And that should also be the guiding principle at the G7 summit meetings. And second, as I mentioned, what we also need is a cross-referencing between Asia and Europe. And we also need to embrace European engagement in China, vice versa for Japan's engagement in Russia, but in more coordinated manner. And economic engagement need to entail with geopolitical conditionality. And finally, I think Japan is, I think, in a wake of defining its own so-called economic diplomacy. Probably tomorrow, Japanese government will publish the first white paper on the economic diplomacy. And that also entails how important geo-economic concept should be factored into the Japanese diplomacy. And I think that this concept will also lead the global agenda that Japan and the United States mutually need to pursue. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you to all of you. Let me abuse the chair and ask a quick set of questions, and then we'll open it to the audience. So, listening to your presentations, I kept thinking of the quote attributed to the British Foreign Secretary at the beginning of the Reagan administration. And, you know, Reagan confounded a lot of our European allies, not the British, but many of the continental allies quite a bit. So the Foreign Secretary, in a meeting of European foreign ministers, listened to all the complaints about Reagan, unilateral, unpredictable, yada, yada, yada. And at the end he said, yes, everything you say is true, but they're the only Americans we have. And started trying to shift the discussion to how do we deal with this new president and strengthen our position, taking advantage of the elements of Reagan that might be good for Europe, and it did turn out to be very good for Europe. So with that spirit, let me ask first, I'm going to ask Nakayama-sensei and Kato-san one question. Nakayama-sensei, you said the U.S.-Japan alliance is not a standalone institution. That's an excellent line. And Kato-san, you said Japan has no place to go. So implicit in that set of statements is the idea that it suggests a certain passivity to Japan has no place to go and nothing to do but hug the U.S. That sounds very passive, sort of accepting the fate that Japan has been dealt. And yet, as you said, Nakayama-sensei, this is not a standalone alliance. It's part of a network of alliances, the neoliberal order, the United Nations. So my question for you, Kato and Nakayama-san, is can you give us one or two ideas of how Japan might affirmatively or proactively shape a Trump administration's role in the world? And then, building on that for Terada-san, your discussion of the geopolitics of TPP was really interesting. And of course, one of the major purposes of TPP, aside from the economic benefits, was geopolitical, was to lock the trans-Pacific geostrategic relationship in place, to lock the U.S. in with key partners and push back against any notion or any effort to create an Asian-only bloc. That was a large part of TPP for Abe, for the Australians, for everyone. So, when Malcolm Turnbull says we're going to invite China to TPP, that strikes me as a really silly thing to say. Because, as you point out, China's not going to be able to do that, but it kind of completely undermines the geopolitical purpose of TPP. And so the question for you is, how can Japan maintain the geopolitical purpose and intent of TPP without TPP? So building TPP with other partners so the U.S. can dock in is also quite passive in a way. It keeps open an option, but it doesn't shape China's perception or regional perceptions. Is there something Japan can do, an economic dialogue in areas that might be easier with Mr. Trump? coal and energy and nuclear power, or the role of the ADB in the World Bank, or protecting intellectual property rights, or WTO cases? Is there an affirmative, positive agenda that Japan might lead with the U.S. on? And finally, for Jimbo-san, let me ask you, you did an excellent job describing the cross-referencing of Europe and Asia and the economic drivers. I take one exception. When you say state capitalism is one of the major challenges to the international order, I cringed because as a graduate student, I think I'm older than you, in the late 80s and early 90s, I was forced to read I don't know how many books about state capitalism being the new threat to the neoliberal order, most of them written by people at Berkeley or Stanford, and most of them pointing to Japan as the threat because of Japan's state capitalism. So you might briefly help me understand what's different, or maybe those guys were right. But what I really wanted to ask you about is the geopolitics. To the extent one can discern a geostrategy from the Trump team, not the cabinet secretaries, who sort of know what they're doing, but from the new team in the White House and around Mr. Trump, to the extent you can begin to discern a geostrategy, if there is one, and I think they're trying to turn Mr. Trump's words into a strategy, it would be, I think, align with Russia to isolate ISIS and China. Does that make sense? Particularly in light of the geo-economic factors. So those are the questions for you. Maybe Nakayama Kato first.
Well, thank you. Well, the question you gave us is a tough one, because a global commitment is a antithesis to what Mr. Trump represents. But I take issue with the fact that we sounded passive.
Okay.
Because what I was trying to say that we have to be forward-leaning in choosing U.S. And that's a bit different from, being, maybe at the moment we're passively choosing the U.S. But that's not the right choice. What I was focusing is that we should be more forward-leaning.
Lean in is the term of art in the U.S.
Oh, yeah, lean in.
Lean in, yeah.
And that is because what we worry most in our region is the uncertain rise of China, of course. And if you pile up what China is doing, we see a glimpse of China-centric order. And we don't think that's good for our region. Not because we're anti-China, because we think the open and liberal rule-based order is good for our region. And maybe Japan may be the only country who is explicitly saying no to that kind of order. But can we deal with that alone? I mean, we can't.
China's the only country explicitly saying no.
No, we are saying no to the Chinese-centric order. And we need partners, and we need institutions. But are there any options? There's no sub-regional organization, global institutions like UN, you can't really trust it. Japan's sort of becoming a full-blown military power. There's no willingness among the Japanese public to do so. This notion of a neutral, honorable nation, that's a fantasy. So we have to realize that this is the only choice we have, but it is the best choice we have. So we affirmatively choose U.S. So I wouldn't call that a passive situation. It's the most rational and the best choice.
And thank you, and you implied it, and that's very helpful. Yoichi?
Well, I think Japan can do two things. One is to show the reality if, what is going to happen if Trump administration really pursues with the America First agenda. I made a presentation in a very simplistic way, but actually Japan has a place to go, not no place to go, because with those four options that I laid out, they are not, as you know, not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. Those four options can coexist, actually. And even in one country, at one point, those four options can exist at the same time. And it depends on where the center of the gravity is. But this alternative shift can happen without really abandoning, default position. And so what Japan can show is that, if United States really pursues this, stick to this kind of approach, the the alliance could transform to the detriment of U.S. national interests, and U.S. diplomatic standing will deteriorate, and regional state has to find a way to live with that kind of reality, and that doesn't really make United States, in a better position. That's one point. And second point is to show that alliance network is interest multiplier, and actually that's what it is. It seems to me Trump is thinking very simplistic zero-sum term in many ways, but actually international relationship is dominated not by a zero-sum term, but actually plus sum. It could be plus sum by depending on how you structure it and implement it. And actually, the Japan-U.S. alliance is, I think, interest multiplier. And if we show that how the interest could increase by staying in alliance and improve the alliance, then perhaps we can engage United States under Trump administration. Thank you.
Thanks. Robinson?
Thanks, Mike. I think what Japan can probably work towards the United States is not necessarily some specific, policy area like energies and the development which you just described. Probably that may be so, but I think what probably Japan should try to do is first to tell the United States the usefulness of multilateralism, in which Japan can cooperate with the United States more effectively. And yesterday, I heard the press conference by Mr. Spicer, and he denied the so-called reciprocity in his comment, which is the basis for, the multilateralism in both political and economic spheres. And only superpower like United States can actually say like that. But the smaller nations or sort of middle powers, tend to more focus on the so-called multilateralism to realize their countries first. The bilateralism is not necessary in this case. Smaller nations more like the finding the place for their voices to be heard. So Canada, Australia, for example, work very hard to promote UN. Singapore, WTO, something like that. And more significantly, in TPP, in my view, TPP is a product of so-called U.S.-Japan cooperation in some of the negotiated agendas. Most prominent one was, of course, the dairy products, blocking New Zealand's, the claims, and even the local content ratio, which now I heard Mr. Ross and Secretary of Commerce elect strongly criticized. Actually, TPP would offer lower. That would be probably a bit difficult for the United States to accept. But nevertheless, that would be actually quite coordinated, result of a coordinated diplomacy or negotiation between Japan and the United States. So personally, I'm quite looking forward to the Mr. Trump's first, the appearance in some sort of multilateral diplomacy. Well, in Asian context, APEC summit meeting, half a year later in Vietnam. TPP summits has been always held in APEC summit as the sideline meetings. So I think Japan or other countries should invite Mr. Trump to come to TPP summits. And how the useful. Even APEC, the summit could be also interesting, the window for Mr. Trump to talk directly with Asian leaders first. Just quickly, I agree with TPP with China would be geopolitically almost meaningless. So that's why I disagree with Australian government's views, China participation in TPP. So my view is other TPP members' participation in RCEP could be, again, it's strategically a significant move from China's viewpoint. But again, even from Japanese viewpoint, that could be, as I mentioned, useful way for U.S. to reconsider the TPP position.
Quick yes or no question, Tarada-san. Is RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a Chinese-led FTA?
I don't believe so.
Thank you. Yeah, I read it every day in the paper now. There are a lot of problems with getting out of TPP, a lot, but RCEP is not a Chinese-led trade negotiation. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike, for a great question about the state capitalism. Obviously, that the Japan's development model since 1960s was coined by the government's strong involvement in the government, which actually led to success of the industrialization policy of Japan, and also that has been copied to the many of those Asian economies. That creates the Asian miracle as a whole. But I think that the model also entailed the promise of some kind of taking off model to making deregulations, marketization as a political correctness, and also as an economically viable option in many parts of the world. Japan for increasing its competitiveness, for Asia to break through towards the middle income trap. So that has been regarded as like a late stage of the government involvement, but at the eventually that will coming into the liberal market order. But what we are seeing today as a model of the China and Russia is the government-backed economic model, even in the extreme end of the development's maturity. So Terada-san mentioned about the SOE, which occupies 40% of the Chinese GDP. 1990s, the SOE was almost like a huge, the source of the huge problem. And now they are actually driving the Chinese economy because of there has been an external market, especially in the real estate, energy, and also the financial, provisions that creates the huge, I think, externalities of how those model can also be applied in the world market scene. So that creates the huge challenge in my terms. So that's a response to number one. And second is on Russia. I think you're right. I think Trump administration's one of the first priorities in foreign policy is counter ISIS. In that case, that U.S.-Russian rapprochement will make some sense. But I would not know how this policy might apply to China under the concept, because it has a huge kind of parameters in dealing with China. And I think from our Japanese point of view, the best scenario that we can imagine out of those options may be that Obama's quasi-pivot concept could be fulfilled by Trump administration because of the huge investment in the defense, and then tough policy on the major, the flashpoints in that region. But they also, I think, entails like three major risks. One is a retrenchment risk. Second is emotional response risks to many problems. And the third may be the grand bargain risks with China. So in that regard, that in China policy, we had a huge parameters from pro-China, anti-China, pro-engagement, anti-engagement, and then Trump policy can go everywhere. That's my assessment on it.
It's so interesting that several of you have pointed out your concerns regarding a Trump administration involve completely incompatible and mutually contradictory outcomes. A grand bargain with China or unilateralism. And I think it's evidence why a foreign policy based on unpredictability may have some utility vis-a-vis adversaries, but with allies, it's never good. Let's open up for some questions. Yeah, there you go. We have microphones, and quickly identify yourself and fire away.
Oh, I don't mind standing. Vago Muradian from Defense and Aerospace Report. Tremendous panel, Mike. Thank you very much. The question I have is, obviously there is an expectation that many have that the incoming administration is putting a strategic priority on a better relationship with Russia, including perhaps even unilaterally lifting sanctions that have been imposed after the invasion of Crimea. Seeing as how President Obama's red line also resonated in Asia when it was crossed and unenforced, what's the Japanese view of the United States potentially but from a European perspective, putting its allies under the bus, which is how it's perceived by some. How would that resonate over in Japan and in Asia?
I'm going to select people for timing consideration. So Jimbo-san, you should answer that because you're cross-referencing between Europe and Asia is right on this point. And then maybe one other person if you want to weigh in, please.
Well, I think for Japan, Russia has been viewed as the significant power in Asia, which provides the alternatives for broadening Japanese strategic portfolio. That's how I think how I should view Russia's role in this region. Because something we want to avoid at most is Russia-China entanglement in every strategic arena in Asia. Alliance, missile defense, countering China and North Korea. And something that we would like to do is to diversify Russia's interest in Asia. And we know that Russia has its own version of the pivot to Eastern Siberia, economic, political, and geostrategic. But we also sense that Russia don't like to pivot to Asia only through China. So in that sense, that there have been an opportunity for us to invest in Russia's interest economically and also in the political sense. And that is, I think, our strategy in developing Japan-Russia relationship. In that regard, I think the U.S. rapprochement in Russia may provide us that the alliance management and our diversification policy may in line with it. But from Russian perspective, probably they have another thoughts, which is using the Japan cards in probably countering the influence of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So I think we are building upon a very fragile balance in those relationships. But I think our policy remains to be the priority number one, maybe how to deal with China. In that regard, that's something that we want to do is to divide the interest between Russia and China in every possible arena that we can find it.
Stanley, in the back.
Hi, Stanley Roth, no affiliation. If Mike thought the presentations were perhaps passive, my thought was they were perhaps too rational. Meaning you worked backwards. You said every alternative is lousy, of which I agreed, some of them scary, but since they're all lousy, therefore America hugging must work. But what if the Trump administration ultimately doesn't want to be hugged? Where would you go? One of the options identified, or is there a less lousy hunkering down option, built on surviving 4 or even 8 years?
Maybe Kato and Nakayama?
Well, actually, I think Japan has an option, and I think it's possible and likely that Trump administration come out and say, I don't want to be hugged. And then we can hug. And then think of the combination of those alternative options together and make it a one option. For example, if you combine 3 options together, the alternative option that I laid out, build up a military capability, looking for alternative alliances with a coalition of other states, and accommodation to China, but this controlled accommodation to China, limited accommodation to China. If you combine those 3, I think that could be a fairly good option. And then perhaps, I'm not saying that there's going to be a 100% U.S. hugging or zero. I think the reality is somewhere in between. But with this decrease of level of hugging could be supplemented with those, combination of the choices. I think that is in reality going to happen. Thank you.
There's a group named, the Alliance Mafias, and the common mental attitude among the Alliance Mafia is let's not think beyond the alliance because there isn't any. If you accept that, you can become a member of a, ample mafia, right? And it's so true in a way. There was, some student protests in the 60s. There were some, movements last year, in fact, or a year before last, going against what Prime Minister Abe is doing and the U.S.-Japan alliance, the SEALs. Professor Jimbo is at the forefront in countering those movements to a certain degree. But because of Mr. Trump and what he represents, I think there's a mood in Japan that maybe we have to start thinking about this. Although it's not a rational choice at the moment, this intellectual dead end, I mean. Maybe we have to think beyond the alliance. And my answer is beyond the alliance is the alliance, that we have to re-choose the alliance. So I think it was a shock, but I think I wouldn't say it's a positive effect, but it's a different effect that Mr. Trump sort of had upon us. So that I'm not answering you directly, but it's an interesting effect that's we're experiencing in Japan.
Just to clarify, you were describing what you have to do to get in the ample mafia in Japan.
In Japan.
Okay, in the U.S. you have to be bald. Okay. Like Joe Nye and Rich Armitage. Detroit, like me and Stanley, get an exception, get a waiver. Last question from Ria, which I'm hoping might get Terada-san into the conversation.
Thank you, Mike. Mireya Solis from Brookings. And yes, my question is for Terada-san. And, I am puzzled as to why the Japanese government continues to double down on the notion that they can persuade Trump on the merits of TPP, especially after the carnage speech, to borrow Nakayama-san's term, and also given the fact that the first executive order was withdrawal from the TPP. So if the concern is that Trump is going to advocate a protectionist agenda, I think that saying that the TPP is meaningless takes away all leverage from Japan. And I would say that, TPP is not meaningless economically or geopolitically if we talk about a TPP 11. I don't know if you've seen the Kawasaki-san's estimates of the economic gains from a TPP 11. They do show that the market access gains sharply reduced, but that the largest gains were always going to be in the rules area, and those are not diminished by much. So it actually makes a lot of sense for Japan to go forward. And geopolitically, if TPP was discussed as creating an incentive structure for China to reform, why couldn't you now reformulate it as an incentive structure for the United States not to fall into unilateral protectionism? If you have two ongoing multilateral trade negotiations, RCEP and TPP, and the United States is not part of it, you begin to get allies in Congress and business who actually may like to temper some of the protectionist impulses of Mr. Trump. And I think that will work better than direct appeals. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, probably what I can say is the TPP, compared with RCEP, at the moment, it's still, the growing framework, which means already Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, they have, of course, South Korea as well, have shown an interest in joining it. So I think TPP's weakness was said to be the scale of economy. United States and Japan simply predominating. Other smaller economies, just following it. But in Indonesia, Thailand, in Philippines, the population is, of course, Indonesia is more than 200 million people, and in Philippines and Thailand are also following it, less than just 1 million, 100 million. So I think those the growing economy in the Asian countries showed an interest mainly because United States they just supported it. So I think we are all, of course, talking about TPP from geopolitical the implications, but TPP is the first purpose was, of course, to maintain the economic growth, and then how we can use it for political and strategic meaning. I think now the United States, Japan, it seems to me, have quite diverging views on that. Obama administrations, Japan, other countries, even Vietnam, Philippines, shared these views on it. For example, Vietnam and now very engaged in the so-called domestic economic reforms, and just partly because of TPP. But of course, major purpose was to, of course, to help the economic growth. But another purpose was to reduce the trade imbalance, to reduce trade reliance on China. And that could be probably best way, one of the best ways for Vietnam to maintain its claims in South China Sea or something like that. But the Trump administration is probably still not showing any sort of interest in Southeast Asia or ASEAN type of issues, particularly using TPP or something like that. Prime Minister Abe probably coming here next month. I don't know, probably showing try to persuade TPP, anything like that. But some of the skeptics emerged, particularly after his meeting with Trump. Again, no information was given to the public like us, normal people. But there is probably strong view that he talked about TPP. It is believed, at least I believed. But soon after that, Mr. Trump, the TPP, U.S. would withdraw from it within the first day of his administrations. Okay, what happened to Abe's, the attempt to persuade him? I think he might lose his faith in a sense. But he continued to say, Mr. Trump is still reliable, according to his speech last week in the Diet. So again, probably he tries to do it. If other ministers try to persuade other Trump cabinet, Trump administration members, but I personally still doubtful it. So it's simply part of the U.S. The attempt within the country to just move. Otherwise, foreign countries find it very difficult to persuade other countries, particularly big powers like the United States, and to change its views on it. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for that last intervention, Maria. I think it sort of reinforces why right now we could use a lot of Gaiatsu. And of course, Gaiatsu was never effective when it was just Gaiatsu, external pressure on Japan back in the day. It only worked when there was Naiatsu, when there were constituencies or interest groups within Japan that had a stake with opening and internationalization. And while the inaugural speech threw a lot of people off who were growing optimistic, the reality is there remain incredibly powerful actors and interest groups in our system, from the Republican Congress to state governors to business to farmers and exporters to work with, and other allies and friends who care about the international system. So, if Shinzo Abe has to take some criticism for hugging Donald Trump and building a relationship to be able to make that work, I'd say he's doing not just Japan, but frankly, the rest of the world a big favor for the reason Takayama-san said. This is not a standalone alliance. And I think Abe-san is positioned actually to do something for the whole world and helping, a friend and ally think through how to separate the bad from the good and start putting together a foreign policy that might actually grow the economy and help people who want change in this country. That's my final sermon. But for a really substantive and analytical one, before our reception, we've asked Matt Goodman, I think here, Matt, to tie together the threads of this conversation and give us our closing benediction.
Thanks, Mike. And I know you do want to get the reception, so I'll try to be brief. So it's hard to follow a dream team like this, and I won't really try to comment on everything they said, but there was great food for thought there, and I think I am going to take a lot of that back and think further on it. I love this talk about geo-economics. That's not a term that I exactly use, but my whole life, for actually 30 years, but certainly here at CSIS, working in a foreign policy environment as an economist, has been about elevating and spotlighting the importance, the strategic significance of economics in foreign policy. I think it often is left to an afterthought or seen as sort of at best a tactical measure. How can we incentivize someone with a little, a gift of some kind, or punish them when they're naughty with a sanction? But we don't think of it in terms of the strategic place that it plays, and a lot of other countries do. China certainly thinks of economics as a strategic tool of their foreign policy, so I think it's great to have this conversation. Look, I just 3 points. One, the liberal economic order is under great stress. That's a statement of the obvious. I think there are two main sources of that stress. One is new challengers to the order, large emerging markets, of course, China and Russia, but also democratic countries like India and Brazil. For now, up to now, I think the interest of those groups has been more about seating arrangements than it is about the actual rules. It's more about the setting of the table rather than the menu. But there are some differences on the menu, and I'll come back to those in a sec. But I also think the other source of stress in the order is that its economic benefits are not as strong or not as clear, at least, as they were for the sort of 70 years post-World War II. Growth is slower everywhere. Imbalances persist. Wages and incomes have been stagnant or growing very slowly. Inequality is rising. And all of these things gave rise to the sort of nationalism and populism that fed the Trump phenomenon. Now, Trump is right about the anxieties that underlie these changed economic circumstances, and about Washington's failure to address, first of all, to recognize in some cases and to address with real policy solutions those anxieties. And I think people like us need to spend more time thinking about those things, and we're going to certainly do that in the Simon Chair and think about solutions to those domestic economic anxieties. But Trump was obviously too quick, has been too quick to dismiss the benefits of the liberal order and of globalization, and just to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And his prescriptions, especially the protectionist talk on trade, are misguided, and they'll actually make those anxieties worse, which is the irony of all of this. So that's sort of my first point about the stresses in the liberal order. Again, obvious point. But to me, the biggest failure of Trumpism so far is the failure to recognize what the real flaw in the global economic order is, which is that the rules are out of date. They don't meet the current challenges of a supply chain-based global economy, and they don't deal with the digital economy sufficiently. They don't deal with a lot of new realities in the global economy. And there's going to be a competition over those things if there isn't already. And that was the power of TPP. That's what TPP was really about, and why yesterday's action was so harmful, even though perhaps inevitable or expected. Not inevitable, it's expected, but very harmful. I always say that TPP really has three objectives or purposes. One is economic, obviously, another strategic, and the third is what I call strategic economic. So the economic, is obviously something that is at the core of this, but let's not kid ourselves. It's not probably game-changing for the United States economically, what TPP would do. But cutting 18,000 tariffs in one agreement and raising U.S. GDP by 1/4%, that doesn't sound like much, but 1/4% from one initiative, I'll take that as an economic policy guy. That's not bad. So it's significant. It's not, it's not game-changing, but it's significant economically. Even better for Japan, obviously, much bigger gains for Japan. The strategic one, these guys know much more about and have talked about, but it's obviously an essential complement, TPP, to our military strategy in Asia. But the strategic economic, which is the one that sort of interests me, is this point about rules, and TPP really did move forward the ball. It didn't solve all of these problems. It didn't fix all of the rule issues, but it really did advance the ball and establish a set of disciplines that is more appropriate for a supply chain-based world where a lot of the frictions in the economy are behind the border, not at the border. So tariffs and things are not the only problem. They're still a problem, but they're not the main problem today. So it had disciplines on services, on IP, on intellectual property, on digital trade, on labor and environment, on regulatory transparency, on state-owned enterprises. And so if you go through the 30 chapters of TPP, you don't have to read the whole 6,000 pages. Just read the headlines of each chapter and ask yourself whether the United States and Japan have a stake in establishing strong rules and disciplines on those things. And I think you'll find that we really do, and that without the things that were advanced in TPP, we're worse off. All these benefits are now foregone, and of course they've also, the walking away from TPP has really raised serious questions about our credibility, not just in Asia, but globally, because we put so much capital behind this initiative. But look, I also think and I think it's been touched on here when you talk about the immutable things in life. You can change, an election can change a leader, it can change policies, but it cannot change national interests. And our national interest, the United States national interest, is being engaged in high standard rulemaking in Asia, in the Asia Pacific. And so I think we will get back to something like TPP. It may not be called TPP, it may not have exactly the same 30 chapters, but I think we will get back to some sort of high standard multilateral, or maybe a network of bilateral, if you can make that work, agreements that that serves those broader interests. So I sometimes use the metaphor of golf. It's like we're playing the game of golf, and the United States has just hit the ball into the woods, and we're going to be hacking around in the woods for a little while, but we're still playing golf, and we need to get that ball back in that hole. That hasn't changed. So we're going to get back on that course eventually, but you may have to wait 4 years. Or maybe 8, because I was so wrong until about 8:30 on November 8th. I was completely wrong in predicting what was going to happen at 8:31. So, don't believe anybody who tells you that this is going to be over in 4 years. It could take 8. Third final point. So it's ironic that we've decided to pull the plug on TPP just when the United States and Japan had reached the pinnacle of their cooperation on economic issues. After 30 years, all the time Mike and I have been working on Japan since we were studying Japanese right down the road here at SAIS 30 years ago, has been all about bashing and passing and other things that are in that sort of broad set of negativity. But here we are. We reached this pinnacle of our cooperation, and now the U.S. is pulling the plug. I mean, we had gone really far. Read Article 2 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. It talks about, quote, eliminating conflict in our international economic policies and encouraging economic collaboration between us. That's a mandate in the Security Treaty that we should be doing this. And TPP did that, okay, and we've just pulled the plug on it. But we've done that. So what do we do? Keeping TPP alive in some form as an 11 undertaking, or maybe trying to get something going in an FTAAP, as Terada-sensei mentioned, getting TPP and RCEP, the TPP 11 and the RCEP countries together. Doing something like that would be, I think, very helpful for Japan to be working on over these next few years, even if it doesn't, come to even a clear conclusion in that time. I personally think this talk of a bilateral FTA between the U.S. and Japan is not all that constructive. I mean, I understand that's what the new team wants to do, and there's a certain logic to it, but I think that's going to be really, really hard, because imagine the agriculture or the auto negotiations in that bilateral talk. It's going to be a lot harder. And so we'll get distracted kind of with the old issues, but the problems are the new issues, right? And the U.S. and Japan agree on the new issues. That's why TPP was so powerful, and why Mike Froman, against my advice, by the way, leaned so far in to bringing Japan into TPP back in 2010 when it was first raised by the Japanese. And I said, wait, we can't do that. And because of the old issues is what I was thinking. But Mike understood that the new issues is where the power of having Japan in this agreement. And so I just think if we do that bilateral FTA, we're going to spend all our time arguing over autos and ag for the next 20 years, and we're not going to get anywhere. So I think we need to work on the rules, and we're not going to be able to do it in TPP. So let's work on the digital economy. Let's figure out what we want. We want an open internet. We want unimpeded cross-border data flows. Let's use all the forums we can find to do that. I'll mention some of those in a second. We need to work on frontier rules and standards, from 3D printing to 5G wireless, from the Internet of Things to space. There's a lot of stuff for the U.S. and Japan where we're aligned, where we can work together. Let's work on the global multilateral agenda, on TISA, on environmental goods, on OECD export credits. Again, I'm not sure the Trump administration is going to have a stomach for all of those things until they hit reality and they see that those things are actually useful. Let's work on quality infrastructure together. Japan has launched a great initiative in that space in Asia, focusing on life cycle cost issues, social and environmental safeguards, basically bringing the rule of law to infrastructure investment in the Asia Pacific. We both have a lot to offer there. Let's work on women's empowerment. Let's work on youth empowerment. These are things we're both very feel strongly about and have a lot of need to move forward on. And I would use every forum we can use to do that. Bilaterally, if that's the preference, let's have an S&ED between the U.S. and Japan. We used to do that kind of thing with Japan, and we've stopped doing it. Let's have a high-level dialogue between the U.S. and Japan and bring the private sector into that. Regionally, APEC, I'm not sure whether President Trump is how he's going to feel about APEC. Most presidents are not enthusiastic when they realize they have to fly halfway around the world for a talk fest and put on a silly shirt. But I think Trump may be drawn to it because it's a chance to interact with his peers and maybe the silly shirt. And there's a promising sequence of hosts coming up. You have Vietnam this year. You have Papua New Guinea, believe it or not, is the host of APEC next year, but that really means Australia will be in charge, so that's a good year. And Chile in 2019. So there's a good trajectory of hosts in APEC. Let's take advantage of that and find ways to advance on some of these issues. And then globally, if you don't like the G20, again, interested to know whether Mr. Trump's going to go to the G20 in Germany in June, but the G7 in Italy in may be a little more interesting because it's closer to bilateral, at least, and you've got Brits and Canadians and other, friendlies like that in the group. So, I'd use the G7 as a place to advance some of these issues on that substantive agenda. So with that, I'll just leave you with a golfing metaphor again. The U.S. and Japan are playing golf together. We're both pretty good, but we're on a difficult course. There's inclement weather, and the U.S. just hit the ball into the woods, right? And we may be there for the next 4 years, as I said. But we need our partner to keep playing straight and true. And that's an uncomfortable role for Japan. But I think you uniquely, really, certainly in the advanced world, I'd say in the world. I mean, I can't think of another country that has the combination right now of political stability, economic capacity, policy capacity generally. What you're lacking is confidence and maybe some tools in the security area. I'll leave that to Mike and the rest of you. But basically, I think it's a matter of confidence. But we need you to play strong. So I'll leave you with a Japanese phrase that the Japanese side will understand. But it doesn't really translate into English, but it's useful in this context. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu.